Good day. I'm here today with Laurie Dennett to have follow up on our series of conversations about her book, Waybread. Today, David Duncan, who is the coordinator for the Hamilton chapter of Canadian Company of Pilgrims and a CCoP board member, will be conducting the interview with the questions he's developed with her. And I'll be happy to step out of the way and let them have a good time speaking together. So welcome, Laurie. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
Great to see Laurie's smiling face again. And I gather we understand it's a nice day where you are, Laurie. Very close to O Cebreiro.
Yeah, it is. Lovely sunny day.
Well, that's a nice change because sometimes it's a bit rainy there, I've heard.
It is indeed. Sometimes the fog is very thick outside and I can't even see the top of the car from where I'm sitting. So,
oh boy.
But anyway, today is not one of those days. It's lovely.
No. Well, we're with you in spirit. It's so nice to see your face and hear your voice again. And looking forward to a really interesting conversation about a fascinating man. And you feature him in this book, Waybread, which you've released recently. And as you may know, I was particularly interested initially on talking to you about the amazing Donativo in Rabanal. But then when I got to this chapter, I thought, no, I'm going to have to call up Laurie and see if I can interview her on Don Elias, because the story of that man, I didn't know until you and I and Colleen, my partner, chatted about that when we visited you last year when we were doing a Camino together. So we learned a little bit when we were visiting you, where you're sitting right now, and read this chapter, and I was fascinated. So I really wanted to chat to you a little bit more about him, because I think there are a lot of folks that are contemplating walking on the Camino, and those even who have walked several times who may not know anything about this person and why he's so important. So I hope we can pull all of that and more out of our conversation today.
Well, I hope we can. It's always a pleasure to talk about him. And it's funny, I talk about him reasonably often, and I never get bored with recounting his exploits because they were so extraordinary. So anyway, fire away on the questions, whatever you'd like to say. Ask me.
Okay, sounds good. Well, you knew him. I'll maybe start here. Is you knew him towards the end of his life. Because most of his operations, as I understand, as a parish priest, and then certainly the work that he was doing for the Camino, were based in O Cebreiro, very near where you live. How did you come to know him in the first place?
Well, I first met him when I passed through O Cebreiro as a pilgrim in right at the beginning of June 1986. And another stalwart of the Camino, his friend, Father Jose Maria Alonso of San Juan de Ortega, had sent him a newspaper clipping about me. And there were so few pilgrims in those days that, you know, the newspaper clipping was sent with kind of a note saying, you know, this person is going to pass through, for sure you will meet her. And he walked into the dining room, as he always did, of an evening, and there I was sitting with 3 other people, and he came right up to me and spoke with me and asked about my journey and so on. And then I think we chatted a little more than that, but the next time I met him was actually about 9 months later in a conference in Germany, in Cologne, and this was very significant. He came up to me, we did chat at coffee and so on. He was one of the people that he recognized, but he came up and asked me if I would take a photograph of the group of Spanish attendees, he being one of them. They'd all jammed themselves into this little car to get there, 5 of them. And so I took a photograph with his camera and handed it back to him without dropping it, which was something for me. I'm not terribly adept, but it turned out that this was a new camera with which he was even less adept. So he came up to me again the following day and said, would I be interested in or able to translate his new guidebook to the Camino into English? And I was so honored. I stammered out, well, yes, I would love to do that, but I had a book that I was working on first. In fact, I had two. But the minute I was free, I would love to do it. So we left it there, really. And then a bit of time went by, and finally I was free of those books and got to write, to the point of writing to him to say I could come and talk about the guidebook now. Didn't get any answer. And so I went out to O Cebreiro in March of, I'm sorry, I've left out the Haka conference, where, of course, I met him again. He'd organized the Haka conference, and I had got myself on his little bulletin mailing list, and we exchanged the odd postcard. So, you know, we were in touch all this time. But I went to see him in March 1989 by now, and having written to him at Christmas '88 and not had a reply. And it turned out that he was very, very ill, and he'd had a couple of surgical interventions, and he was recovering in a relative's house in Lugo. So I went to see him there, and we talked more about this guide. And I said, well, I think I'm going to be walking to Rome. If I can't take it now, it will have to wait. And he said, well, you go and walk to Rome, and when you finish that, you come back here and collect it and take it away, and that will be that. I'll be finished and you'll be finished, and you know, we're more or less away on to the next project. So I agreed to do that. And I made my pilgrimage to Rome, had a couple of cards from him en route. And when I got back to O Cebreiro at the end of September 1989, I found that he was really very ill and not quite finished, not quite finished. And so he asked me if I would go with him and his brother-in-law to a kind of what I understood as a kind of spa on the almost on the Portuguese border. And I said, well, yes, of course, I'm here for this and for you. I'll wherever. So I went with the two of them, and began really one of the most extraordinary journeys one could imagine. I won't go into too much detail, but it turned out not really to be a spa. It turned out to be a place where an old curandero of the type that live up in the hills and that local people often resort to. You know, Elias's brother-in-law was a great devotee of this man and had promised him a trip down the Camino to correct the last set of proofs of his cartography if he would accompany him to this place. So the poor man had had 2 weeks in this utter dump of a town with nothing to do in the course of the day except go and drink this herbal water. And the brother-in-law is a very fine chap, but very content to pass the day playing cards and drinking the odd coffee and beer and so on. And poor Don Elias was just sort of stuck there with the daily paper, and that was it. So anyway, I went, and I quickly realized that my task, as much as anything, was to try and keep his mind off his illness and on the Camino, and push this project along as far as we could. And that was really how we spent first 1 week, and then we went back to O Cebreiro for a weekend, then another week, and we went back to O Cebreiro for the weekend. And on the third week, I was realizing that I was not going to get back to London in the 2 weeks that I had allowed for this, and rang up the Prudential, which was holding a project for me, and bless the directors of the Pru, they just said, come back when you can, when you're ready, don't push it. So I just stayed, and we worked a bit on this as much as he could in the course of a day, just checking things. And then the rest of the time, what did we do? We talked about everything under the sun. We played a lot of chess. We listened to a lot of music. I sent his nephew out to find me a chessboard. I told him, I don't care if it's made of plastic or if it's made of marble, but I think your uncle would be an avid chess player. And it turned out he was. And the first day we had that chessboard, we played for 9 hours straight. He did not want to stop to eat or drink or anything else. And the brother-in-law just drummed his fingers on the table and went away, and just left us to it. So anyway, that's really how I got to know him. As I say, we did talk about everything under the sun, although mainly things Camino. There were a million things I asked him about, and he told me all manner of things. And he turned out to be a very, very easy person to talk to. I think I was on his wavelength, really. And, I remember hearing him comment to his family when we went back after that first weekend. He said, "She's wonderful company. And it does me good, to have someone to talk to about intelligent things." I took that as a tremendous compliment. So there we were. And I ended up being there as he got, first of all, we were in that place in Portugal and just on the Portuguese border, which really was something else. Again, I'd like to go back there just to verify my memories of it. I wrote up a journal every day, which is what I still read when I want to reconsider all of that. Then we went to Pamplona, to the Clínica Universitaria there. It's the best medical facility in Spain. And we were there for nearly 3 weeks. The family.
That's a long time.
Yes. I mean, his niece and her husband took us there, and then effectively left me to get him to his medical appointments, and otherwise simply keep him mentally occupied, and make sure that he was fed and dressed and clothed and got where he had to be on time, and read to him. I taught him a bit of English. He taught me a lot of Spanish. And so we went on. And then eventually we came back to O Cebreiro, and he was initially much better and could actually walk again and receive friends, and had a wonderful 10 days, I guess, there. And then he began going very rapidly downhill. And in the end, I went with him in the ambulance to Lugo, and I was with him when he died, and had promised him that if he didn't see his guidebook through the press, that I would. And so that really kept me in contact with his family and with the Camino community and with O Cebreiro, and it just grew from there, really. I think it was a tremendous gift and an honor to have that time with him, because he had many, many friends, and a lot of Camino friends, much, much closer than I could have been. But I think my perspective came to be quite unique, in that he really did open up and talk about the Camino, perhaps in a way that he hadn't to anyone else. I'm not really sure of that, but I wrote a lot down. I've got a great big folder full of notebooks that I'm now writing all this up about. So it was a very intense and moving time, because I became aware of what a responsibility I had being in the position I was. One of the doctors at the Clinica in Pamplona said, "I don't know how you're going to do it, but you have to ensure that this man eats 2,000 calories a day."
Oh.
And since he only has half an esophagus, that is not going to be easy. You're going to have to use all your creativity there. And I did. I put a great deal into trying to be as much of a mainstay as I could be, not just for him, but of course for the family. This was an absolutely harrowing time. And I found myself in Pamplona. I was, in a sense, the interface between him and them, because he couldn't, go out to a telephone box and phone them every evening. I did that because he couldn't stand up long enough. He was very weak. So there were a lot of things that I never expected to find myself doing or to have to learn, but did. And I think all I can say was it was a situation I think I rose to, and I've been very grateful to have had. So you want to go on from there?
Yeah,
Probably
wow.
should do more than you really wanted to know, but
Well, you know what never ceases to surprise me, Laurie, is whenever we chat, I learn so much, and there's so much richness to the stories that you tell. And I had no idea that you'd spent so much time with him at the very end of his life. You touched on that last year, but I had no sense at all that it was such an intense experience for you as well. And you've kept notes about that extraordinary man and about those times, which and whatever he was saying. So maybe
oh
we'll hear
yes,
more about that someday down the road.
you know, and I would like to pay a tremendous tribute to his niece Pilar, who was probably the closest person to him of anyone, and she saw that we got along together well and that I was good company. I think she appreciated that, and she just sort of moved over and gave me a bit of space. She just sort of let me occupy that space, because obviously her first priority, as mine, was doing the best for him. And if he wanted to play chess for 9 hours and couldn't do anything else, who were either of us to quarrel with that, you know? And he, you know, she used to say, you know, try and read a bit, but he found reading the heavy tomes that he was used to really quite difficult. And one of the times in Pamplona, I went out to the bookstore that he really liked, and I thought, buy him something completely different. And I came back with Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man in the Sea. And I thought a greater contrast than that, it doesn't exist. And I gave him that, really wondering what he would think of it. He loved it. He absolutely loved it. And one priest friend of mine back in O Cebreiro said, "What on earth are you doing reading this?" And he grabbed it and he said, "It's very good. It's wonderfully written. It's vital. It's vital. It's full of life." And I thought, that's the stuff, you know, what we need are things that are full of life, so that this man does not simply allow his mind to dwell on, is he going to get better? Isn't he? The things he wanted to be doing and couldn't, all that kind of thing, you know. He would often send me out for maps and, you know, pens and things like that. But when it came down to it, it was very exhausting, the kind of thing that he wanted to do. So tried to find things that poured the life into him, really.
You've touched on and we're just talking a little bit about who he was, because not everybody knows, but you've touched on some of the activities that he was involved with over the many years with regard to stimulating an interest in fact, being a central force in the resurgence of the modern day Camino. You touched on the Haka conference, the guidebooks. In broad strokes, and just in summary, before we get into some of the other details, what is important for modern day pilgrims to know about Don Elias and what he did?
I think that despite all the changes that there have been in the Camino, both in its physical entity and its you know, the development of it in the last 35 years, etc., he is still the person who gave today's pilgrim the route they're walking on. He was the first person to really think about the Camino as a whole, as an entity that stretched all the way back into Europe. He was a historian, and he knew that the Caminos to Santiago began way back, you know, in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia and in the British Isles. And he knew that the Caminos across Spain were many and varied. And you mentioned a question, I think, one of the questions you sent me, you said, were there other people working in this area? Well, yes, of course, but they, I would say, were all concerned with their own immediate locality. And, you know, the association in Estella began in 1962, the French one having begun in 1950. And in the Estella Association was full of very knowledgeable people about the history of the pilgrimage, but they, I don't think, conceived of it as a universality in the way that Elias did. And you asked about waymarking and people like, Canon Javier Navarro of Roncesvalles. You know, he went out and marked the trails that led to Roncesvalles in the 1970s. There were no yellow arrows then, but the Pyrenees were full, absolutely full, of the French long-distance walking groups, Grand Randonnée symbols and slashes, the red and white bars that they would put on trees and the cross lines to indicate the right direction or the wrong direction. And there was all of that, but there was nothing actually to lead any hiker who might want to spend a night at Roncesvalles to there. So he made it his business to get people to Roncesvalles. Now, in due course, of course, that came to mean pilgrims too, and probably even then did mean a few pilgrims. But these were relatively local efforts. And you asked about this. Now, this little book, this cartography here, that was produced by the Estella Association in 1971. And the cartography, I don't know whether you can see it, it's the right size for a pilgrim, but it isn't the right kind of appearance for a pilgrim. It runs from bottom to top in very thin strips. And it's actually quite tricky to follow properly. In 1986, I walked with somebody using this, and he was always having to resort to mine. Now, mine being Don Elias's third one, he, you know, this, let me backtrack a little bit. This is his doctoral thesis, which was published. It's a historical juridical, i.e. how the Camino evolved in the medieval period through the laws of kings and deputy, nobles who were entrusted with parts of it. So there's all kinds of laws about how pilgrims are to be protected and the laws that they have to abide by in there. There's all sorts of delineation of the route and the places it went to. And he distilled the essence of that into this tiny little book called Camino de Compostela, which doesn't have any cartography. It's just text and a few photographs, but it came out in the same year as this. And he felt that this was what pilgrims needed to read to find their way. They didn't need to be puzzling their way along with this. So those three, 1971, that's what we have. His thesis and these two items. Then, you know, through the 1970s, he was working on other projects, but also on the Camino. In 1982, for the Holy Year, 1985, he was asked to produce this by the Ministry of Transport and Tourism and Communications, the Secretary of State for Tourism, who was Don Manuel Fraga, whose name you will know. He was then, remember, we're still, in the post-Franco era. He was minister, and he asked Don Elias to prepare this guidebook, really as a guide for people in cars. They were desperately trying to get the Spanish economy back on something like the rails, and the country was devastated right into the 80s. It was very poor. And so Elias accepted this commission and formed a team of the people that he had come to know in the course of his many journeys down the Camino, and a team of collaborators in each province. So if you look at this book, you see Javier Navarro as the collaborator there. He and Elias did Navarra between them. And you see a lot of other names, Antonio Viñayo and people like that in Leon. And then, so he had his team of provincial collaborators, and they would fan out and get other people to help. This was the network that led to the formation of the associations along the Camino Frances. You can see it literally individual by individual, growing out of people that Elias came to know in the 70s and the 80s. And internationally, of course, you have him meeting people like Paolo Cauchi from Italy and Robert Plutz from Germany, and getting them fired up with enthusiasm. So they go off and start associations in their respective countries. And in 1985, you get this book. This is the book that the ministry handed to Everest to produce for pilgrims. Now, nobody knew better than Elias. This is his cartography here. Nobody knew better than he that this format was not exactly convenient for a pilgrim, but it was the best that he could do at the time to get all this text in and so on. So that was the book that he was trying to improve on when I met him in the spring of 1987, and he asked me to translate his guidebook. And after his death, another priest friend of his and I got this through the press, polished it up, got it through the press. I translated this one into English. His friend translated it into Gallego, and we got somebody in France and somebody in German to do translations of that. And this book came out in 5 languages in time for the 1993 Holy Year. So that was the posthumous Galaxia guide. And then this was his final work, really, and the love of his life, his absolutely beautiful hand-drawn cartography, redrawn in 1988, when he was still well enough to walk the Camino and stay up till all hours of the night working on it. It's got little trees, it's got fountains, it's got everything. It's simply beautiful. Yeah. And when Galaxia could not afford to publish this, and no Spanish publisher came forward to offer, despite many trips to ask them about it, I took this to London and took it to a specialist map publisher called Roger Lascelles, who knew nothing about the Camino, but he took one look at this and said, "This is just a jewel. I must publish it." And so he did, and that's the cartography.
Amazing.
So I didn't mention in passing in that broad brush summary that you asked for. In 1985, having got some associations off the ground and so on, Elias was asked to be the kind of head of the fledgling association of associations, and given a mandate to more or less do what he could afford to do. And he started producing this tiny little Bulletin of the Camino de Santiago, first number, July 1985. And that carried on. He produced 10 numbers of that right through until the summer of 1987. And at the Jaca conference in September, the first draft of what is today the Review Peregrino magazine, which we all know, that took over from this. So I hope that goes some way towards explaining how things have evolved and why he deserves and receives such respect, because mainly a lot of the people who are around now, like Anton Pombo and, great guide writer of other Caminos and so on, were literally handpicked by Elias to go away and help work on it in some capacities. And, most of us are still around. Some people aren't, but so there we are. On to the next question,
Wow.
if that's any help. And
Wow.
can I just round the edges of this? He was editing one 3-volume gigantic work on the diocesan archives of Galicia, and a 6-volume one of historical and artistic monuments in this part of Spain. 6 volumes of that. And when you said Don Antonio Beñoyo said, when does he ever sleep? Everybody said, when does he ever sleep? Because it wasn't at all apparent when he ever slept.
Absolutely,
it was extraordinary.
Absolutely formidable, a force of nature. And one of the questions, and you've just answered it in spades, and I'm sure you could talk for hours, is why should 34 years after his death should we be concerned about the words and actions of a Spanish cleric? I mean, he was a remarkable individual, and I loved how you framed it. And I think this will be the takeaway phrase for me after our interview, regardless of what comes next, is that as you pointed out at the very beginning, he gave us the route, literally gave us the route on which we walk. And I've never really appreciated that truth until you said it that particular way. So thank you. That was really helpful to understand the history of why it's so important that all of us know what he was about, and how we are now beneficiaries of that incredible work over decades.
Well, he himself depended to a degree on the work of Vázquez de Parga, Lacarra, and Oriariu in the 1940s. Great big 3-volume work on the European pilgrimage. But what he did was get that out of the history books and into the minds of people who saw it as he did, as something that could be physically undertaken. It was a route to be walked, not just read about.
Right.
So, and he saw it as an entirety, as today's pilgrim starting in Denmark or, in southern Italy sees it as an entirety, because it's from his own front door all the way to Santiago. It's a very long way.
Yep.
So,
in Waybread, you mentioned that he turned down opportunities to rise in the ecclesiastical ranks. I mean, with a mind that was capable of all the things that you've mentioned, he could have done anything, I suppose, in the world of the church. But he chose to stay in O Cebreiro and work on all of these different undertakings. It's a short question, but probably with a huge answer. But maybe, is there any way you can summarize what is it that drove him?
Well, can I again?
You only have 1 hour. No.
Rewind the tape a little bit. I haven't even mentioned O Cebreiro. Now,
Right.
he saw O Cebreiro as a 16-year-old schoolboy. This is one of the things that he told me about, because I asked him exactly, more or less, the question that you've just asked me. How did you find yourself where you've been for the past 30 years? Why here and not some other place? And he said, well, I saw it as a 16-year-old seminarian on a day outing. And of course, Cebreiro was in ruins then. And he had a sense that he found it quite difficult to put into words, but almost a premonition that he had some kind of calling to do something about that place, because he even then knew enough to know that O Cebreiro was very ancient, that it was the lowest place in a range of mountains in two directions. So it was a crossroads and had always been a crossroads. And the route that was coming from the southeast was the ancient pilgrimage route. And it came right through Cebreiro. And the fact that it had survived all those centuries was largely because of mercantile traffic and the few pilgrims and, you know, messenger traffic along that route. And so he did feel drawn to it. His uncle was vicar general by the time he was himself ordained. And he'd originally wanted to go to South America as a missionary. And he went to Buenos Aires to visit family there and decided against that, I think, because he couldn't get out of O Cebreiro out of his mind. But it was a good thing that he did come back, because 3 priests had refused O Cebreiro as a calling by the time he was offered it in 1959 and accepted with alacrity. You know, and was there for the next 30 years. And the first things he had to do were get the authorities interested in restoring it, because there were, you know, 9 houses, 9 families living up there in the most abject poverty, no running water, no electricity. The palhoças were shared with people's animals. The crops were what they could grow in a place with a short growing season. Ill health was rife, you name it. It was problematical there. And yet people were not unhappy. I mean, there are a number of older people, and I've come to know them well over the years and talked to them a lot. They felt that their life was, you know, the best of all possible worlds kind of thing. The rest of the world went by, and O Cebreiro, you know, remained. It was eternal. But anyway, Don Elias set about getting the authorities, you know, right from Madrid on down, local authorities, regional authorities, provincial authorities, and national ones, interested in this as an archaeological site, because he was very convinced that there were earlier remains there, and he turned out to be right. That was because he knew the sources so well. And so they had, in 1962, they got the church restored, and in the course of the investigations there, they discovered an even earlier one under it, and a pilgrim cemetery. So all of that. Then they got the old monastery fixed up as what became the Hospederia San Geraldo de Aurillac. And he got his sister to come and cook for the workmen, initially in pretty dire circumstances. And the stories about that are rife too. And little by little, they managed that. And you know, winter and summer just never stopped. And then he persuaded I'm not sure which authority it was, to give each family a proper house to live in, with sanitation and electricity. And you know, the first telephone didn't reach O Cebreiro till about 1982. Oh, wow. Anyway, he got people out of the palhoças and into proper houses, and he found or created jobs for some of them, so that they had a steady income, especially the ones with children. He made sure that the small children learned to read and write. And I have a friend who is today a doctor who had her first lessons in reading from him. You know, so he turned his hand to everything, and he was just such a self-giver. You know, he just never stopped. And you said, what drove him? Well, he loved what he was doing. he genuinely did. I don't mean to make him sound at all like a martyr. He just rejoiced in having the opportunities to do the good that he did do. And he loved doing little things, I mean, that meant a lot, and people still remember them. You know, Los Reyes, the 6th of January, Epiphany here is a big feast, but nobody in the parish ever had money for a gift for children or anything like that. He made it his business to drive all over the place in his old car and buy up candy, and he would whip his family into line like an assembly line, and they would fill up bags of sweets for every child in the parish to receive on Los Reyes. And for many of them, it was the first time they'd ever had a present of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
So he was much loved. People who grew up when he was here never forgot him, and when they still are happy to talk about him anytime.
That's amazing, and thank you for sharing a lot about the man. And I'm interested now in shifting gears a little bit and getting your impressions on what he might think about the current state of the Camino, and also what do you, as a veteran, a very experienced pilgrim yourself, think about the current state of the Camino. So let me start by asking you this question, kind of a fun mental exercise. If he were here today, let's say he was at the table where you're sitting right now, what would you want to talk to him about concerning the Camino these days?
Well, probably the need, the ongoing need to ensure that it is still possible to walk the Camino in a simple, austere way with very little in the way of economic resources. Because it concerns me that, there are aspects of the expansion and extension of the pilgrimage that give me much joy. I love it when I see families with children able to do it, when I see retired people able to do it, because there's now enough accommodation along the way that you don't have to plug along for 30 kilometers the way you did in 1986. And, you really had to be in good form and probably not much over 60 to do it comfortably in those days. Well, that's expanded, and pretty well everybody can, including people with disabilities, in people in wheelchairs. There was somebody here, chap being guided, a blind man being guided by two people who was making it, walking, and enjoying it very much. There's so many positive things. I'm sure you know them as well as I do. But I do worry about the potential fate of the long distance pilgrim, that pilgrim from Poland or from southern Italy, who simply cannot afford, 40 or 50 euros a night for a bed.
Right.
And may really have to scramble and may eventually not be able to do it at all beyond the Pyrenees, because it is just so costly now to do it. And also you asked, I think in one of the printed questions, you said about experiences being of the Camino, as I recalled it, as being inherently salutary. Well, they are today too, if people will let themselves have them. If you've got a back problem, by all means, send your backpack ahead. But you learn so much from finding out what you need and what you don't need. And if you just take the easy option and send a great, 18-kilo rucksack on ahead because you can and because you can afford it, you never get that lesson. And it's a lesson that spells freedom for you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
If you want it.
Yeah.
If you want it. If you don't want it, well, that's another thing. But if people have come onto the Camino to gain new perspectives on the world and to find out what they themselves are made of. It's hard to see people throwing the very opportunity away that they supposedly have come out to find. And I feel the same about mobile devices and being super connected all the time, and forgetting how to map read because the GPS does it all for you,
right,
etc. And maybe that just means I'm a dinosaur and a fossil. Well, so be it. But you give me this beautiful cartography any day, even though it's now very out of date, as over a GPS, and I'll take it, I'm afraid. So anyhow,
well, for anybody who hasn't read Waybread yet, I would direct them instantly to page 24, because I reread that this morning in preparation for our conversation, in which you elaborate on what you've just spoken about. And as one of the coordinators of a chapter of the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, I am going to be taking all those words on pages 24 and 5, frankly, to heart, because I think they will form part of the answers to the questions that we get a lot these days from people contemplating the Camino and are instantly asking about, and I had another one this morning, asking about companies they should use, and who, the question today was who can move the bag. And to your point, some people will use those services, and that's appropriate in some cases, but I'm quietly wondering to myself if the marketing machinery is so strong these days that people who are exploring the Camino for the first time are seeing ads before they actually know any of the traditional ways of traveling, and maybe they simply don't know that an earlier, simpler, traditional way is the way for the vast majority of people, though not everybody. So anyway, that's a rhetorical question for me, but I would certainly direct people to even the early parts of your book for a really sound summary of some of the things you might miss if you're overly reliant on some of our modern methods.
Yeah, I would say, use them insofar as they serve you, but don't let them dominate you.
Right.
But anyway, you asked about, has anything been lost? Yeah. And I would say something that is in danger of being lost, and people now have to make an active attempt to find it and stay in it, is simply silence. Yeah. Silence is such a blessing. And another reason for not being plugged into things is hear the bird song and hear the traffic creeping up on you too. But certainly in woodland areas and so on, it's just such a delight to sit down somewhere and just open yourself to all of that. And I think if you asked if Elias were here, what would he say to a pilgrim? And I don't know. I wouldn't presume there, but I wonder whether he would say, look, leave a little space for providence, leave a little space for happenstance, serendipity, the unexpected. Don't plan everything down to the last, the last dot. It takes a weight off your mind, but it can rob you of some real moments of unexpected joy, and also that wonderful trust that is such a feature of the Camino, which has been here for centuries and people still live by it. It's just that modern pilgrims find it hard to believe until they experience it. Well, if they never do experience it, they go home the poorer because they could experience it. So
I see and this is typical of conversations that we have, is we can go on and on, but there is one question I think we've got time for as we near, I think we're getting close to about an hour, and we want to have about an hour's worth of recorded interview with you. So if I'm a little off and I've got a couple of more times, I know a little angel will put up maybe a couple of fingers or how many minutes I have left. But one question that I thought I would ask you before we go is what role might international associations, in fact, what role perhaps might within those little chapters like ours here in Hamilton and elsewhere in Canada play in sharing your words that are written in Waybread? Because I think the messages that you've got in there are things that need to be shared. That's why you wrote the book. But what might be the role for the rest of us to play in sharing these kinds of words?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of really wonderful books by Canadian authors, as we know. And does, for instance, the Canadian company have an online bookshop? Do you actually have a venue where you can dispatch books, or is it simply easier in Canada because of the geography and the organization to simply review books and let pilgrims or putative, potential pilgrims go off and be inspired and buy the ones they want to,
Yes, that's what we're doing at the moment. We have a page that's dedicated to Canadian authors of publications that are about the Camino. I don't think there's ever been a plan to go beyond that because there are so many other channels to get the physical books or get the ebooks perhaps, but that's what we've limited ourselves to at this point.
Well, what more can you do? Well, I think, as we said the other day, in another conversation with Lee, this set of ethics that you're drawing up, and the idea that attending international events when you can, sending somebody to that, and getting them to report back and making sure that your own viewpoint as an association is brought to gatherings like that, that you get an opportunity to speak and to learn, swap ideas and so on. That is very useful.
I very much think, I mean, with respect to the words that you've written in Waybread, you're a torchbearer. I mean, you've been there in some of those early meetings, like the HACA conference, for example. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that, there's those of us who have listened and learned from you and others like you about some of the history that might not always be apparent, but I think is vital. It's us to take up that torch and carry it a little bit further as well. So I guess that's really what I was wondering about, if there was anything you would advise in that regard. But I hear it's the conversations, the continuing networking, the talking, and sharing some of these stories that people might not run across naturally.
Well, something that you might try is trying to get the, I don't know, anthropology, religion, cultural departments of the Canadian universities to take an interest in pilgrimage and foment pilgrimage studies across the country too. Now that probably will involve, a certain amount of, saying to people, look, you've got to get to grips with Spanish, because anybody can read the conclusions of the HACA conference. They're all the conclusions of all the conferences that there have ever been, the big ones anyway, are on the Federation, the Spanish Federation website for anyone to read. The problem is that in the non-Spanish speaking countries, there are not that many people who can just sit down and do that. So if you've got some strong Spanish speakers who would be willing to do a bit of volunteer, reading and distilling for the rest of the membership, you might think about tracing some of these ideas back to HACA and seeing how they've evolved and where they should be going, whether they are going, and if they're not going where you think they should be, raise it at the next international conference. There's a task for you,
Yeah.
There's a tremendous amount out there in the way of information, but a lot of it is in Spanish, and anyway, that just going to involve getting to grips with it.
Yeah.
So
Well, all the more reason why Waybread is such a valuable resource for many of us, because you've brought us into the world of things that we wouldn't necessarily have come across by ourselves. So thank you for a lovely book, and it's a lovely reminder of your beautiful garden with the labyrinth on the cover. Fond memories of a visit there with you. So Laurie, always a delight to chat with you. Nice to see you're well. And I'll pass it over to Tom to wrap things up for this interview, but a really enjoyable conversation, and I look forward to the next one.
Oh, thanks so much, David. Always a pleasure to talk to you too. It's just great. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, David. Really appreciate the two of you being here together and giving us some great history of Don Elias and how important he was to us, and how the Camino has gone forward and probably fulfilled his prophecy that he was preparing for a great invasion.
Yeah.
True
right.
enough. Yes, indeed. Yes. Yes.
So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We'll speak again, I'm sure. Okay.